Okay, Thomas Freed here with tax-freedom.com and the @taxfreedom YouTube channel. Again, that's tax freedom with a hyphen. And this is part 4 of our expose on the federal income tax and the maladministration of it by the Internal Revenue Service. And we're up to here. Well, we're going to look at employment tax law because, as we've seen, the original tax law under the Tariff Act enacted in 1913, a tariff being an impost, the power to tax foreign activity. The original collection authority of the income tax from 1913 to 1945 was limited to the collection of the tax by withholding agents, who, as we have seen in the statutes, are only authorized to collect the tax from foreign non-resident alien persons, individuals, and corporations. They're not allowed to collect the tax from citizens. That's why they had to pass the 1945 Subtitle C employment tax laws to create a whole new class of tax collectors called employers. And the employers, like the withholding agents, are limited to only a certain group of people that they can collect the tax from. The withholding agents could only collect tax from non-resident alien individuals. The employers can only collect tax from their employees who allow it. And I'm talking specifically with respect to the collection of the federal income tax as opposed to the Social Security tax, which is a different discussion. Today, we're talking about the federal income tax. So the employer is a new class of tax collectors defined in the law in the 1945 subtitle statutes. It's actually in chapter 24 of Subtitle C, and we're going to look at that in a minute real quickly. It's those employment tax laws in 1945 by which the American people are controlled and by which your wages are controlled to enslave you to the government. It didn't happen in 1913. There was no collection authority that reached the wages of the American people. So in 1945, they create the employers. They create a system of collection by allowance. And how do we do that? Here we go. We do that on a form W-4, the Employees Withholding Allowance Certificate. This is where you ask your employer to dock your pay for a tax that's not imposed on you that you don't owe. You assume that you owe it. In doing so, you fill this out on your first day of work at 16 and put down single and zero. Single, zero. Where's that? Well, anyway, it's total number of allowances right here. Single and zero are married and however many. And when you do that on your first day of work, you're enslaved forever on the false presumption that this applies to you and it's something you have to do. First of all, no one can force you to pay a tax before it's legally due next year on April 15th. There's no money due when you get paid. This is your voluntary option. That's why you have to allow it on an allowance certificate. Because they can't force you to do it without violating the 13th Amendment's prohibition on involuntary servitude. They forced you to pay it when you got paid rather than did it by your allowance. They were compelling you to a condition of involuntary servitude by forcing you to service the future obligation before it was actually legally due by law. That's a violation of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits both slavery and involuntary servitude. You can't be forced to service a future obligation, especially where that obligation is debt involved, which is what the heart of this all goes to, the $34 trillion in debt owed to the Federal Reserve Bank. Because all of this money taken out of your pay, none of it is tax. None of it goes to the Treasury. That's why you have to file on April 15th, because there is no record at the Treasury of you having paid any tax. You have to file to create the record. But the employer took all this money from you. He sent it into the Treasury. How come it didn't get there? How come on January 10th you don't have a record of having paid X thousands dollars of tax already based on this collection of tax and the statute that requires all tax to be deposited in the Treasury by law on a daily basis, Section 7809. So here's how they get you. And instead of claiming single and zero and married, what you should be writing is exempt down here. Claim exempt, and you can jot in under IRC 3402N if you want, because look at what it says. It wants your name, your address, and then a declaration. But if you don't make a declaration, you can add an additional amount you want taken out for whatever reason. Or number 7, I claim exemption from withholding for 2019, or the tax year that the return is for. And I certify that I meet both of the following conditions for exemption. Last year, I had a right to a refund of all federal income tax withheld because I had no tax liability. And this year, I expect a refund of all federal income tax withheld because I expect to have no tax liability. Now, they've changed this language in the last few years to deceive the American people. It used to say that I had a right, that I had no liability for tax under Subtitle A last year, and anticipate no tax liability under Subtitle A in the current year. This right to a refund of all tax, that's their interpretation of the actual statutory command to have no liability for tax under Subtitle A. They've changed the language on the form to hide from you the true requirement. It has nothing to do with a right to a refund. It has to do with liability under Subtitle A. And if you remember, the only persons liable for tax under Subtitle A were the withholding agent. So if you haven't collected any tax from a non-resident alien as a withholding agent, you can lawfully claim exempt on this return. That's why they altered the right to a refund, their own interpretation of the no liability for tax. But let's see what the law says. Here's Section 3402A, and this is what the United States government, this is what every employment attorney in the country will tell you is why you owe tax, is because of this statute. This is why your employer has to take it. Let's see what it says. 3402A, requirement of withholding. Oh, that sounds bad. 1, in general, except as otherwise provided in this section, every employer making a payment of wages shall deduct and withhold upon such wages a tax determined in accordance with the tables or computational procedures prescribed by the Secretary. Any tables or procedures prescribed under this paragraph shall A, apply with respect to the amount of wages, and B, in such form and provide such amounts as the Secretary determines to be appropriate. Okay, so the tables used to be part of this, but they've moved them. No big deal. But this says every employer making payment of wages shall deduct and withhold. This is what the employment attorneys and the accountants, if they know, all point to and say, here's why your company has to take this money from you. Your employer making payment of wages shall deduct and withhold. They got to do it. It's absolute. It's right here. But wait a minute. What are the first 7 words? Except as otherwise provided in this section. Now, what kind of clause is that in the English language? Is that a clause of subordination? No, I think it is. And when you see a clause of subordination in the law like this, what it means is, hold on, wait a minute. What you're about to read might not actually be the true command of the law imparted by this code section. You're going to have to read all the rest of the provisions in the statute to see what else, if anything, might be otherwise provided. And then you're going to have to read that and decide if it applies or not. Now, if you do this, 3402, section 3402 is intentionally made very, very long. It's like 21 pages long. A, B, C, D, E, F. F used to be entitled exemptions. And the only people made exempt were full-time students. So you're supposed to give up and forget it. But G, H, I, J, K, L, M. Maybe we should have started at Z. Z, Y, W, X, T, S, R, Q, P. It doesn't matter if you go from A or Z. You have to read 11 pages of code to get to subsection N. Oh, look. Employees incurring no income tax liability. That kind of sounds like, well, let's read. Notwithstanding any other provision of this section, an employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold any tax under this chapter upon a payment of wages to an employee if there is an effect with respect to such payment or withholding exemption certificate in such form and containing such other information as the Secretary may prescribe, furnished to the employer by the employee, certifying that the employee, 1, incurred no liability for income tax imposed under Subtitle A for his preceding taxable year, and 2, anticipates that he will incur no liability for income tax imposed under Subtitle A for his current taxable year. That used to be the language verbatim on the W-4 form. But people showed them they had no liability under Subtitle A under Section 1461, so they altered the language on the form to hide the truth from the American people. It now says you have to have a right to a refund. That's not what the law says. The law says nothing about a refund. The law says no liability under Subtitle A, which goes to 1461. They've even removed the subtitle from here, so you can't trace the liability. I mean, this is just intentional fraud. This is how you intentionally deceive and enslave a nation of people. So they've altered the claim. The law is still the same. The law requires no liability under Subtitle A. Last year and then anticipated this year. It doesn't matter whether you mistakenly did it. You didn't have any liability. Liability, remember, has to arise in statute or it's unenforceable in the federal courts. Courts can only enforce statutes. They can only enforce the written law. Liability isn't in the written law. If it isn't prescribed by statute, by all the statutes I showed you in Part 3, the court can't enforce it. And this says, notwithstanding any other provision. Well, first of all, again, now let's look, what kind of clause is this? Notwithstanding any other provision of the section. What kind of clause is that in the English language? We saw that subsection A up here has a subordination clause that says, never mind any of this, it might not really be the law, it might be somewhere else. We get down here and it says notwithstanding. Do you know what notwithstanding means? No, apparently very few people in the country and in the legal industry and sitting on the bench know what notwithstanding means. Notwithstanding means regardless, regardless of. It's a supremacy clause. This is a supremacy clause in the English language. Notwithstanding any other provision of this section, regardless of any other provision of this section, an employer shall not be required to deduct and withhold any tax under this chapter upon a payment of wages to an employee. The employee certifies no liability under Subtitle A this year, or in the preceding year, and no liability in the current year. None in the preceding year and anticipates none in the current year. Liability is only under 1461. You should be claiming exempt. Now they've changed the form again and made it even harder, but they didn't change the law. They just made it harder for you to understand and exercise your rights under the process, to be a free man rather than a controlled peon, whose wages are controlled for the purposes of servicing the debts owed by Congress, the IRS's master, and yours too, owed by Congress to the Federal Reserve Bank. Whole thing's a fraud. They defraud you and deceive you about the nature of the collection. the allowance for the withholding, the exemption provided under the supremacy clause in the controlling code section. That is the reason why the tax attorneys tell you this is why we have to do it. And when you show them what the code section said, really, and that this is a supremacy clause that destroys completely the authority they thought that they had possessed under subsection A, they don't want to talk about it anymore. And all of a sudden, this is not the law they use. They don't use this law. But this is the law you said made you do it. What do you mean you don't use this law? Here's the true command of the law and the statute. No withholding. No withholding. And again, the employer shall be liable for the payment of the tax. Okay, let's do something here I don't normally do. Let's jump out and look at Subtitle C, employment taxes. Here's the code. I want you to notice the structure of this code here. Chapter 21, federal insurance, FICA, that's Social Security. It's a matching tax. Half to the employer, half to the employee. There's the Railroad Retirement Tax Act. The railroad has the same kind of matching tax, and it's got an extra one. We're going to look at that in a minute. Railroad unemployment. Here's collection of income tax at the source. So this is collection of the tax. Let's look at this real quick. Now, Chapter 21, FICA, two subparts, tax on employees, tax on employees. The first code section, rate of tax. First code section in the part on the employers, rate of tax. General provisions and credits, well, there's no tax there, so we don't need to look at that. Go back to that was Chapter 21. Subtitle C consists of just these 5 chapters, 21 through 25. 1, 2, 3, 6 chapters, because there's 2 23s. That's all there is in Subtitle C. This is the body of tax law enacted in 1945. Chapter 22, again, it's a 2-part tax. So look, it's a 3-part tax. Subchapter A, rate of tax. First code section. B, tax on employee. First code section, rate of tax. Tax on employers, first code section, only code section, rate of tax. So every single one of these, the first code section is a rate of tax, just like in Chapter 21, rate of tax. Now we look at Chapter 23, rate of tax, first code section. No subchapters, but the first code section is a rate of tax. And in 23A, imposition of tax, first code section. Chapter 24, collection of income tax at source on the wages. First code section, definitions. Second code section, income tax collected at source. Third code section, liability for tax. Wait a minute, where's the tax imposed? Where's the tax imposed? Every single one of these chapters and subchapters, first code section is tax imposed. We get to Chapter 24, income tax collected at the source, and the first code section is definitions. There's no tax imposed. You're supposed to assume that the tax in 1913 imposed on foreign non-resident aliens is a tax that you have to pay, and let them collect from your wages at work to the extent where you're deprived of as much as 35% of your paycheck. Which means you can't get by, and your wife has to go work, and the kids get raised by the state. So by controlling labor and taking away the fruits of labor, they're able to take over the family home. It also deprives you of sufficient revenues to donate charitably to your favorite church. So it undermines the people's support of religion by compelling them to fund the state instead of what they believe in. So let's definitions, first code section. This is where they define the term wages, which is covered work, and things like employee and C, employer and D, tips. They try to make everything taxable under these things. And 3402, I just showed you. That's the code section requirement of withholding. Except as otherwise provided, every employer has to withhold the tax. But you come down here to code section N, and notwithstanding any of the provision, an employer shall not be required. No liability under Subtitle A, no liability under Subtitle A. There's no tax imposed, people. The entire collection system of tax at work is based on your voluntary withholding allowance. It doesn't exist in law as a tax paid. It isn't there. Right from definitions, employers, employees, employers, or anyone participating as a collector. Employees or anybody working for the employer. Wages or any money paid by the employer to the employee. There's no tax imposed on any of it, but these are very important definitions that you understand you're controlled by. And then there's the allowance for the collection of the tax is shown on the form as an allowance certificate, giving you the right to claim exemption with the language taken verbatim from the law. At least it used to be verbatim, now it's paraphrased and actually modified to require a refund. So you can't argue statutory liability because, of course, they took the money last year. You weren't entitled to all of it back. So no, you haven't read the law right. And we've interpreted it for you and added the requirement of the refund because that's not in the law. And you don't even have any liability for tax under Subtitle C. That's all in the employer. The employer shall be liable for the tax. So, Subtitle C, 5 chapters, 1945, the body of law set up the railroad. Now, the reason why it's got all this railroad stuff in it is because it's implementing the Social Security Act here in Chapter 21, and the railroad complained. They said, you can't make us do Social Security. We have our own separate pension system. And Congress agreed, can't make them do it twice. So they set up a system where the railroad can maintain their existing pension system. And as long as they do, and as long as their employees choose that pension system instead of Social Security, then they don't have to withhold the Social Security tax from those railroad employees participating in the pension system. Only those railroad employees who opt not to do the railroad pension, but rather to take the federal Social Security. So they have to keep track of which and maintain it for both. But everyone gets hit with Social Security, and everyone who allows it has income tax deducted from their wages. You have the right to not allow it, take your whole paycheck, and on April 15th to not file anything that isn't required by law to be filed. And if there's something that was required to be filed that wasn't, it's the duty of the secretary. Remember 6020B, the statute that says that if you need a tax return, it's the secretary that files it. 6020B, execution of return. If any person fails to make any return, the secretary shall make such return. And being signed, it shall be prima facie good and sufficient for the evidence in court and enforceable liability. So if you don't file a return, they can't prosecute you for willful failure to file because it was the secretary who was required to file. If there was a return that was required that wasn't made, you didn't fail. The secretary failed the duty to make the required return. She's the one given the requirement in law, not you or he. The whole thing's a fraud. The whole thing's a fraud. Okay, here we are, 3402. Again, you're not the person liable. Publication 515, withholding of tax on non-resident aliens. This is another publication they like to hide away. I had to go down to the IRS press offices in DC, the reading room, to get copies of this. And it says right here, evidence of residence. If an individual gives you a written statement stating that he or she is a citizen or resident of the United States and you do not know otherwise, you do not have to withhold tax. Now, these are the instructions to the withholding agents, who are the Subtitle A tax collectors. You're exempted from citizenship. You remember the Brushaber decision at the beginning of Part 1, where the court referenced that the tax has to be collected from persons through the corporation's duty to retain and pay the sum of the tax unless the recipient of the funds gave notice of an exemption? Here it is. Here's the exemption: evidence of resident, a citizen, because remember, it's only non-resident aliens that are subject to the tax. And this is the IRS instruction. Everybody on how to withhold tax under Subtitle A. Non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. They don't want to lay that out because the pieces will start to connect in the minds of a few people who probably aren't too far behind me in all of this. But one more. Okay, well, actually, this is claiming to be a person not subject to withholding. Individuals, for purposes of this chapter 3 of the code, that's the collection of tax on non-resident aliens, an individual's written statement that he or she is a citizen, resident of the United States, may be relied upon by the payer of their income as proof that such individual is a citizen or resident of the United States. This statement shall be furnished to the withholding agent in duplicate. An alien may claim residence in the United States by filing Form 1078 with the withholding agent in duplicate in lieu of the above statement. And then the withholding agent is supposed to duplicate a copy of each statement and form filed pursuant to this section shall be forwarded with a letter of transmittal to Internal Revenue Service Center, Philadelphia, PA. The original statement shall be retained by the withholding agent. Okay, so there's process and instructions in the United States law for dealing with payers to exempt yourself from any withholding of tax. No matter what the IRS says, the agent doesn't have the authority to do it. He can only collect from people he's authorized to collect from. If the agent comes in and says, Mr. Withholding Agent, we demand you take money from payments made to the citizen, the withholding agent can't do it unless he's ordered by a court. Only a court of law can order something beyond what's required. And that would have to show a judgment in order to do that. So the withholding agent has to tell the IRS, I'm sorry, I'm only authorized to collect from non-resident aliens. This person's given me a statement of citizenship. I can't take their money. You have to go get judicial process, where presumably he'll be allowed to defend himself and his property. So you'll have to make a case before a judge, and they don't usually want to do that. So if the individual withholding agent accepts the statement, there's no withholding, you get paid. This is all contracts in the country. That's what withholding agents administer now. Banks and brokers and contracted work, all work under contract. They're withholding it. They're not your employer. They're not doing Social Security. They're not giving you vacation time and days off. It's not an employment agreement. It's all contract work, and that makes the payer not an employer, but a withholding agent. And they can all be controlled under these provisions of the law. So this is important for the regular guy, whether he's working as an employer or under contracts, or by contracts as a subcontractor to a contractor, which is popular because there's no withholding. And if the IRS tries to interfere in the relationship, there's no withholding. He's not allowed to. But he doesn't know that. The withholding agents don't know. They don't know the limits of their authority. They're completely blown out of the water when they see it. Oh my God, what are you doing? We have to look at this. And a couple of days later, you get your check. They don't really want to go to court on this because they got no defense in court. And again, it's all happening because the IRS says that it's frivolous to contend the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct non-apportioned tax. So it's the IRS and the DOJ that have reversed the Supreme Court's original holdings, are violating the Constitution on every single element that exists. It's unconstitutional because it's not direct. It's unconstitutional because it's not not without limitation. It's unconstitutional because it's a direct tax without apportionment. It's unconstitutional because it's an indirect tax without uniformity. It's unconstitutional because direct taxation isn't authorized in the 16th Amendment. It's unconstitutional because the 16th Amendment doesn't extend the powers to tax beyond what existed beforehand. It's unconstitutional because it's a tax on labor. It's unconstitutional because it's a graduated tax that divides the American people into classes and creates the class warfare that socialism and communism is based on. Because it comes from the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which is anathema to the Constitution. It's unconstitutional in so many different ways, it's mind-boggling. It's absolutely inconceivable that it could have ever gone this far. What is wrong with the judicial system, the judges, the courts? They've betrayed you. They've thrown you to the wolves. This is insane. So, what's happened recently? Oh, that's right. Congress passed a new law. They passed a new tax law under Donald Trump in 2018. And here's the Congressional Act, Tax Cuts and Jobs Cut, where they're rewriting Section 1, replaces the 7 brackets with fewer, 5. And I popped up here the constitutional authority statement, because before they could write the new law, there's a little story behind this. Let's go ahead and do it. In 2010, when the Republicans took power back from the Democrats, who had been empowered with Obama's election and held both the Congress, the Senate, and the White House for 2008 to 2010. During that period of time, the Democrats couldn't get anything done. They kept yelling and screaming about healthcare reform, Obamacare. They couldn't get it done. In the last 2 months, they finally managed to come together and ram through the Obamacare law that we've been stuck with ever since. But they had wasted the 2 years. In 2010, the Republicans took power. Oh, and then the Democrats came up with 1,000 different bills of all the other things they wanted to do but didn't have time to do, and they were wasting the 2 years arguing about Obamacare and the single-payer healthcare system they were building. So the Republicans didn't like the fact that the Democrats were flooding the House with worthless nonsense, so they wrote a new rule. Says before any representative can introduce a bill on the floor for discussion or debate, they have to first state on the congressional record the constitutional authority for the powers proposed in the new legislation. So before they could write the new tax bill to reduce from 7 to 5 brackets, the Republican Congress had to write a constitutional authority statement for the new law they were writing. Of course, this new requirement put a constitutional authority statement on in 2010, shut down all the Democrat nonsense because they couldn't do it. There is no constitutional authority. But the law now exists, and before anybody does it, they have to come forward and allege what constitutional authority the bill proposes. And if you have a problem with that, you can argue about it on the floor and debate. They have to state what they think it is. So, here we are, the Constitutional Authority Statement from the Congressional Record, Volume 163, Number 178, Thursday, November 2, 2017. This law became effective January 2018, just 2 months later. And it says, Congress has the power to enact this legislation pursuant to the following. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, impost, duty, or excise, foreigners, foreign persons, foreign places, exported goods, imported goods, commodities, licenses, and corporations. Never the labor or the income of the American people. It's not a direct tax. It's never been a direct tax. It's indirect under Article 1, Section 8.1, and here's the declaration on the congressional record under the intent of Congress in enacting the new law. It's not to be a direct tax. under the 16th Amendment. It's an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. There can be no doubt. Here's the statement blown up a little bigger. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 has the power to enact this legislation pursuant. This exposes that what the federal judges and the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service has been alleging for 60 years is frivolous, that it's actually they who have the frivolous argument. It's they who have gone mad with socialism. It's they who have perverted the Constitution. It's not the people who told them for 60 years you're wrong and the judges said it's frivolous and fined them $25,000. They were lying through their teeth. And it's got nothing to do with law or taxation or justice. It's about the tyrannical extortion to compel the support of causes men disbelieve and abhor, but which government, perverted government, embraces. So what is happening in the court? Well, here's a case in the 3rd District, the Federal District Court case in New Jersey, which is the 3rd Circuit of Appeals, where the court ruled that the tax is a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And the 3rd Circuit had no problem with that. They said it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment with no limitation, no apportionment requirement, no uniformity, because it's a direct tax, a new power to tax. They never explained how Congress was constitutionally authorized to write law for that through the absence of an enabling enforcement clause. So technically, this court and the circuit court ruled without ever establishing subject matter jurisdiction, because they were never able to show an enabling enforcement clause that authorizes Congress to write law to enforce a direct taxing power allegedly created under the 16th Amendment, which we've now seen is a lie. That puts the exposed lie to invalidate what this court did to this man, which was take his house and auction it off criminally without subject matter jurisdiction to act. Technically, that means the decision of the court is void. So this court lied and stole the man's property. Oh, here's another court. In Virginia, in the 4th Circuit, this court, when confronted with the fact that there was no enabling enforcement clause in the 16th Amendment, got stuck and had to think about it for about a year and a half. And then the court ruled that the tax is an indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and always has been. But when called on that, the court refused to state whether they thought it was an impost, a duty, or an excise. It's just Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. So they never identified the specific taxing power at work in the case, which means subject matter jurisdiction wasn't disclosed. Because he wasn't told whether it was an impost, duty, or what's he supposed to do? Guess at what the government is trying to collect? Either you tell them what the specific subject matter jurisdiction is, impost, duty, or excise, or you haven't disclosed the nature of the action. You need to disclose both the nature and the cause. The cause is the statute that's been violated. The nature is the authority in the Constitution. So what is the nature? Impost on foreign activity, duty on exported goods, or excise on corporations and ATF? They didn't say. So without subject matter jurisdiction under Article 1, this court stole the property, and the 4th Circuit had no problem with that in Virginia. Okay, now, I have a problem because the uniformity requirement in the Constitution has been ruled to mean that regardless of whether the tax is direct or indirect, there has to be geographical uniformity amongst the states, so that the tax law has to be applied the same way in every state. Can't change it. It can't be different in one state. So if it's a direct tax up here in New Jersey, it can't be an indirect tax down here in Virginia. If it's direct in the Third Circuit, it can't be direct in the Fourth Circuit. It has to be the same tax in all 50 states and all 12 circuits. It can't be one in one circuit and another in another. The judges have no idea what they're doing. They're just making this up to steal people's property. This is outright criminal extortion from the judicial bench. It needs to be the same in all 50 states. It can't be one way in the Third Circuit and another way in the Fourth. That's constitutionally prohibited. Again, it's unconstitutional. Here's a third case out in the 10th Circuit. In this case, the government argued in district court, they don't have to tell you what constitutional authority is relied on. They get subject matter jurisdiction under statutes alone. It's simply sufficient that the statute references the authority to enforce any tax. They apparently think that means unconstitutional taxes as well as constitutional taxes, and that they don't actually have to identify. So they argued in the district court, they don't have to tell you what power is at issue. The statute alone is sufficient. So in the circuit court, they changed their argument. They changed it from we don't have to tell you to it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. Now, at that point, it doesn't matter whether it's direct or indirect, because you're not allowed to change your argument for subject matter jurisdiction between the levels of the court. Either what you claimed in the district court was correct and you argue it in the circuit court, or if you changed your argument in the circuit court, you admit that what you argued in the district court was wrong, and that means the court didn't have subject matter jurisdiction because it was wrong. But that didn't seem to bother the 10th Circuit. They just said, oh no, fine. We can let them change their argument from the district court to the circuit, and we accept their argument that it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, which again was wrong. It's an indirect tax. So you got all three courts in three different circuits doing three different things. It's direct, it's indirect. They don't have to tell you when they can change the argument on appeal. This is not law, people. This is Genghis Khan. This is Emperor Hirohito. This is Mao Zedong. This is Brezhnev. And Castro. And Maduro. And the guy before him. Mind-boggling. Okay, a couple other notes. Here we go. Criminal Investigative Division from the Internal Revenue Manual. This is the authority of the Criminal Investigation Division. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, enforces the criminal statute applicable to income, estate, gift, employment, and excise taxes involving United States citizens residing in foreign countries and non-resident aliens, subject to federal income tax filing requirements, by developing information concerning alleged criminal violations, assists other criminal investigative offices in special inquiries, and secures information from foreign countries relating to tax matters. So the criminal investigation, IRS, CID, they have authority over what? Citizens residing where? In foreign countries. This isn't even a domestic authority. Why would it be? It was an excise tax. And gross income, Section 61, only existed under the Canadian Tax Treaty. And adjusted gross income only exists under the tax treaties with the European nations. We saw all of that back in, I think, part 2. I'm not going to go back there. Watch the video. So everywhere we look, we see nothing but the authority to tax foreign activity. The original tariff limits the United States to the territories in possession. The withholding is only from non-resident aliens. Everywhere you look, it's foreign. The impost authority taxes foreign activity, collected from foreign persons. No tax imposed on the labor of the citizens in the employment tax laws 32 years later. Both subtitles, A and C, in 1913 and 1945 use exactly the same scheme, a collection of the tax at the source, a classically indirect system of taxation where the people who are liable for the tax, the actual taxpayers, are able to shift the burden of the tax by collecting the tax that is turned over to the Treasury and paid. They collect it from other persons. They never pay tax out of their own pocket. Simply turn over what they've collected from other persons. That's indirect taxation. The only authority the collectors originally had to collect was from foreign persons under the tariff. And there was no collection of the tax authorized in law from citizens until 1945. Or 42 in the victory tax, if you want to count that war revenue measure. So if you go to the income tax annotated and you look up in the index income tax, and then you look up the subtopic citizens, what you find are 2 code sections. Right here is civic leagues. That's the next entry. Citizens, civic leagues, citizens. 2 code sections about to depart from the U.S. Waiver of requirements as to termination of taxable year, and living abroad, exclusion of earned income and foreign housing costs and gross income. There are only 2 code sections that apply to citizens under the income tax. 2, both having to do with foreign activity. It's all foreign. Everything about it is foreign, from the Tariff Act to the withholding, to the power to enforce. Now, on the other hand, if you look up aliens on page 413 of the index, here we are on page 413, non-resident alien starts right here. I think you can see that, right? Yeah, non-resident alien starts right here. Non-resident aliens, additions to tax, failure to deduct, 1463, remember 1463? Penalties for failure to deduct and withhold on the withholding agent, not the alien. And of course, okay, then it runs off the bottom of the page. Now here we are, remember, we're on page 413. Here we are on page 421. Page 421, aliens, income tax, non-resident aliens. It's still running. 8 pages later. 8 pages of indexed statutes applying to non-resident aliens. There were 2 code sections. 2 code sections for citizens. There are 8 pages. And here it ends. On page 421, Northern Mariana, this is where it ends. It's aliens, income tax, non-resident alien, withholding of tax, Puerto Ricans, rate, refunds, return deemed, trader business, end. 8 pages. Resident alien begins right here at the bottom of the page, and it ends in the next column right over here. Withholding of tax, Virgin Islands, foreign points, residency requirements, students. Okay, resident aliens, 1 column from here to here. It's 1 column of statutes. Non-resident aliens, 8 pages of statutes. Citizens, 2 code sections, 1 inch. Where's the support for the claim that this is a domestic tax? It isn't anywhere in the law. It all comes out of the claim of gross income. Okay, now this is the Code of Federal Regulations, parallel table of authorities. This is where the government publishes what laws apply to what code sections or titles or parts of titles. So let's go look. Here are the criminal penalties. They apply under Title 27. That's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, not Title 26. No entry. Note that if there is more than one, it's listed. Here's multiple parts, Title 26 and Title 27 for 57, 53. I don't know what that is, but here's 6020, substitute for returns. It's implemented under Title 27, parts 53 and 70. You mean they're not authorized to do substitute returns under Title 26? In other words, they're not allowed to use a Form 1040. Remember the list of forms they are authorized to use? And they weren't in Form 1040. Form 1040 wasn't in the list, was it? Because they're only authorized to do substitute for returns under Title 27. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They have no substitute for authority. That's why they won't sign a return. It would be evidence of a crime. Instead, they use fraud by computer fraud to defraud their computer system, which is a crime too, but at least their signature isn't on it, so nobody knows who did it. Okay, let's look over here. Assessment 6201 and 620304. These are the notice requirements. This is the actual assessment statute that lets them assess unpaid taxes payable by stamp and taxes shown on return. And it's applied and made enforceable under Title 27, Part 70. That's why they need you to voluntarily file. They're not allowed to do it, and they're not allowed to make assessments outside of ATF, just like it says in the statute, unpaid taxes payable by stamp, alcohol, tobacco, the stamp taxes. Here's the collection authority, 6301, Title 27, parts. 6303, this is notice, Title 27. 6321, the authority for liens, Title 27, not 26, no income tax liens, only ATF. 6331 through 43, the levy procedures, Title 27, not in Title 26. Levy for Title 26 tax is illegal. The statute was never enacted for that purpose. Here's the assessment and collection taxes, Title 27. Failure to file, 6651, Title 27. Return preparation penalties, Title 27. Interference penalties under 7212. They accuse citizens all the time. Title 27, no Title 26 enforcement. Civil suits to enforce liens, Title 27. Investigation authorities from 7601 to the authority of revenue agents, Title 27, Title 27, Title 27, Title 27, Title 27, Title 27, Title 27. Not one single statute has ever been published for use within Title 26 enforcement operations. That means the courts don't have subject matter jurisdiction because they're using statutes in a way that they were never intended to be used or are not authorized in law to be used. They can't show that Congress was constitutionally authorized to write any of these statutes to impose a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, rather than to enforce the indirect taxes by excise on alcohol, tobacco, and firearms that all of these statutes were enacted to enforce during the 1930s, during Prohibition. They were going after people like Al Capone. But we got a problem. And here's the last part, and this is a question. I'm not asserting an argument here. This is Title 31, U.S. Code, Subchapter 1, Organization of the Department of the Treasury. And it shows all of the offices within the Treasury that have been created by law and are recorded in the title. Department of the Treasury, Treasury of the United States. You wonder, why is there a difference there? Is that meaningful? I thought the Department of the Treasury would be the Treasury of the United States. You mean that the Treasury of the United States is separate? Is it possible there are two different United States here that are being talked about between the Department and the Treasury of the United States? Why is there a distinction? Oh, we'll come back later. Maybe I'll look at that. That might be fun. Bureau of Engraving and Printing, United States Mint, Federal Savings Bank, Fiscal Service, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, United States Customs Service, Office of Thrift Supervision, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, Office of Intelligence and Analysis, intelligence is always foreign, Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, intelligence is always foreign, Federal Insurance Office, Covered Agreements, Continuing in Office. I'm sorry, but where's the IRS? Where's the IRS? Does this agency even exist by law? Doesn't appear like it. When I researched this, what I found is that the IRS commissioner was created during the Civil War to collect tax from the officers of the Union Army. But because the tax was only imposed on the officers of the Union Army, it wasn't necessary for them to create an office that would have authority in the country inside the federal government, specifically inside the Union Army. So they created a commissioner of internal revenue to administer to the collection of the tax from the Union officers. And they never created any office because they didn't need to. It was just an officer with the authority to collect the tax and the wages, escrow the funds, and make sure they went to the Treasury. So the IRS has never been created in law. They think they created it when they created the officer. But an officer without an office has no authority outside of the federal government over the American people. It has only authority internal to the government over its own employees, over its officers in the Civil War, and it would have authority over foreign persons in the country as well. But without an office officially ever having been created, or an agency or a department with the Treasury, and without any listing in the law, isn't it a reasonable query to ask, where the hell is it? Why isn't it here? And if it's not listed here, is it an agency or a department of the IRS? Nobody wants to answer this question. Judges won't answer it. DOJ won't answer it. Treasury won't answer it. The White House won't answer it. Congress won't answer it. The Congressional Research Service won't answer it. The Senate won't answer it. Nobody wants to address them. Is that because they all know the whole thing is a fraud from beginning to end, as laid out in this 4-part presentation, which will take about 3.5 hours for anyone to get through who wants to be freed, because it all comes back to the subject matter jurisdiction of the court that can be taken to enforce a direct tax without an enabling enforcement clause allegedly created under the 16th Amendment that the court lacks subject matter jurisdiction to impose. It just isn't there. It just isn't there. The only taxes ever made constitutionally enforceable with respect to the American people are the duty, the impost, and the excise of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, all made enforceable at law by the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, original, necessary, and proper enabling enforcement clause that authorizes Congress to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution, not this Constitution and future amendments. That's why every amendment has its own enabling enforcement clause, where it was intended to create a new power to tax. Because without the enabling enforcement clause in the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the southern states weren't going to go along with the New Deal. They weren't going to enforce it. It was going to take law from Congress and troops behind the law. And it's proof you have to have an enabling enforcement clause in an amendment in order for any alleged new power created by an amendment to be made enforceable at law by a constitutionally authorized Congress that was authorized to write that law at the constitutional level. Authorized. It doesn't exist. The whole thing is a fraud, and this set of documents can pretty much establish that and prove it for anyone who wants to put this sort of presentation on for anybody else. And I'm going to be making this presentation and all of its documents available. Well, it's available on the YouTube videos, 4 of them, and I'm going to have the document set available at irszoom.com for, I don't know, probably like I don't know. I'll figure it out. But I'm going to list them over there as a product set. I might add some additional stuff. And that's pretty much all I got to say on this without just running on how criminal this whole conspiracy, this whole fraudulent operation is. When you show it to them in law, they don't want to talk about it. They won't address it. They know there's nothing anyone can say about this. This is irrefutable. This is all irrefutable. I've assembled the documents that make it irrefutable, right down to the constitutional authority statement for the new tax law. Government can't go to court anymore, arguing it's a direct tax. Bang, here's the constitutional authority statement from Congress. Their intent was indirect tax under Article 1, Section 8. You're done. Dismissed with prejudice. It's a defective claim that can't be corrected, because the IRS has done everything they did administratively to impose and enforce the tax as a direct tax, which was all wrong. You needed indirect authorities to begin. It's a fatally defective claim to subject matter jurisdiction. It's a fatal defect in their claim. Here's our source of power. No, that doesn't exist. Where's the authority to write law? Well, that doesn't exist either. And where's the direct taxing law? It turns out we wrote a tariff, an indirect tax. There's no power granted. There's no authority to write law. There's no statute that imposes the direct tax. You can't establish a single leg of subject matter jurisdiction to enforce in the federal courts what the IRS is claiming and what the DOJ argues. The erroneous argument that the direct tax they enforce on you was created by the 16th Amendment, and it's frivolous to say anything else, and they're the ones with the frivolous argument. They can't produce one thing from the Supreme Court that says it's direct. The Supreme Court said, no, we reject that, and they used inferior circuit court decisions to reverse it, to deceive the American people into voluntarily allowing themselves to be trapped in the system of involuntary debt service under a peonage plantation system that comes from the 11th century. And we're arriving at the final destination, a complete and total collapse of everything. So if you want your freedom back, you want your country back, you want your constitutional government back, you want a government of limited powers back, you want a government that represents you instead of rules you back, this is where it all starts, a knowledge of this basic fundamental information that controls your freedom or your enslavement, depending upon whether or not you have within your knowledge this information or not. So it's all there at taxfreedom.com. Now on the YouTube at Tax Freedom is the channel in the YouTube. So I encourage everyone to get informed, get educated, get yourself the documents and the materials, and spread the word. Tell everyone in America there's a $4 book that kills the system. The Simple Truth About Income Tax, $4 PDF download from IRSzoom.com. We can kill this system. And I have a plan for replacing it. So don't worry about what comes next. What comes next is the American people being freed from the chains of communism.